Hi, for those curious minds that wonder what's sitting in some of my shelves, I'm going to go over those two shelves right now. First up is Dance Macabre by Stephen King. It's basically a book that goes into his history with the scary cinema and scary stuff and how he started writing and that kind of thing way back in the 50s and 60s. It's a really interesting book, and I enjoyed it a lot when I was reading it. Then we get a fairy tale that he wrote for one of his kids called The Eyes of the Dragon. It's basically a medieval fantasy, I think. I've read part of it at one point, and for whatever reason, I just kind of faded away from it. Probably should get back into it again one of these days and then maybe even read the sequel, which I think is called Fairy or something like that. Not sure. Then we get another Stephen King that is one of his classics. Everybody loves this if they love Stephen King, I think. The Dark Tower, the first book in the whole Gunslinger series. Or maybe it's the Gunslinger and it's the first book in the whole Dark Tower series. I don't know. I haven't read it. I don't have any of the others. So one of these days, maybe I'll get to it if I ever have time. Then we get a collection of short stories from the master himself, Stephen King, another group of short stories in Nightmares and Dreamscapes. I read about 100 pages of this once, and I got to this one story where it had to do with this maid and her son and this signature and this really rude writer that she had to deal with at her hotel job, and it just kind of soured me on on reading the rest of the collection, or maybe it just put me off and I just never got back to it. I don't remember. But one of these days I'll get back to this and reread the stories I already read and then read the rest of it. And another one here, more Stephen King, writing as Richard Bachman. This one is The Regulators. Um, I've never read this. I've never read the other one, which I think is called Desperation, which is like the other half of this story or the complement to this story. I'm not sure how it's set up. One of these days I'll get to it though. I like Stephen King a lot. It's just I have some of his books and I don't have time to read all of them. And then here we get a Swedish version of Under the Dome, which is called Under Kuppelen in Swedish. So one of these days I may get to that. And you can see some of the writing in this. It's in Swedish there. So yeah, one of these days, maybe I'll use that to actually learn Swedish for myself. I don't know. And then we get to a really old book called The Night of the Generals. Um, this is basically a World War II story. It was written by a guy named Hans Helmut Kirst. Not sure if it's any good. One of these days I'll get to it. Then we get into another person that you're probably familiar with if you read much horror, and that's Dean Koontz. Here is Breathless, which I don't even know what this one's about. And then Darkfall right there. And then we get to The Eyes of Darkness. I've read some Dean Koontz and I really liked Intensity and Velocity. I read Soul Survivor after the miniseries for that came out years ago. Some of those were pretty good books, especially Intensity. False Memory here. I haven't read this one yet. Uh, Twilight Eyes. I got a lot of these at a thrift shop or they were given to me by people that knew that I read a lot. Here's Dean Koontz's Frankenstein, book one, called Prodigal Son. This was an interesting take on Frankenstein, modern day. Basically, he's survived all these years since the confrontation with with Dr. Frankenstein way back in the 1800s. It's a decent book, and the story goes on here in Frankenstein, book two, City of Night. Then there's a book three called Dead and Alive. I haven't read either of these last two. One of these days I'll get to it. And then there's one called The Husband. I recently read The Good Guy, which I think came out either before or after this one, immediately before or immediately after. And it was an okay book. It had a lot of It was kind of almost like a kind of movie-ish plot. I don't know if this one's similar, but I remember both books came out with the cover that kind of looked like this. The good guy had a kind of a bluish cover, similar to this one, but it was an okay book. And then we get The Key to Midnight here, and Shadow Fires, another one of Dean Koontz's, and Midnight. This is an older book. You can see the spine's a little beat up. So Midnight there. And I'm reading a book called Strangers right now by Dean Koontz, and it's about almost 700 pages, and I'm like 220 pages into it, and it's very detailed. He goes really deep into the characters, so it's a pretty good book, but it's a bit of a slog at times. Then we get into a classic, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, and another one that's fairly famous. Maybe you've seen the movie, Ira Levine's The Boys from Brazil. This one's basically about someone who raises a bunch of Hitler clones and tries to basically resurrect Hitler by making sure that the boys are raised and have the same kind of life events that Hitler has. And somebody figures it out and goes to stop them. And we get to the front part of that top shelf there, and we get to some Brian Lumley books. This one's called Necroscope: The Source. This is actually the third book in the Necroscope series. I read the first two, Necroscope and Vampiri, recently. I read this one about 30 years ago, and I really enjoyed it. So I ended up buying a whole bunch of them, which you'll see here. Here's Necroscope 4, Dead Speak, and 5, Dead Spawn. And here's a new series called Blood Brothers, which is related to Necroscope, I think. And then we get this big chunky monster here, which is The Last Airy. And another one that's pretty chunky, Blood Wars. So it's the final book in that 3-book set there. Then we get to some more Necroscope, and we're at The Lost Years. And The Lost Years Volume 2, Resurgence. And Invaders. This is, I think, is the start of a new series. And Defilers. And Avengers. And I think I got one more Necroscope book here called Necroscope: The Touch. I have a whole bunch of the novellas that he wrote on ebook as well. So one of these days I'll get around to reading all this stuff. Then we have The House of Doors, which is basically, I don't know if it's Portal fantasy or if it's Portal horror or if it's just a mixture of both. But that's the first book in this series. And then The Maze of Worlds, second book in the series. So there's that. And then we get to something much different. We get to some classic caper novels. Here's one by John D. MacDonald. So Travis McGee is the main character in these. This one is The Empty Copper Sea. And then we have another Travis McGee novel. This one's called A Tan and Sandy Silence. Not sure what that's about. I'm assuming it's probably taking place either on or near a beach. And we get one more here. I don't know if this is Travis McGee or not, but this is The Lonely Silver Rain. And then we get to a guy who I went through a phase with really buying a whole bunch of his books, Richard Matheson, Earthbound. If you're familiar with Richard Matheson, you know he wrote a lot of the more famous Twilight Zone episodes. There's one called Hunted Past Reason. He also wrote a book called Bid Time Return, which was made into the movie Somewhere in Time. And he wrote Stir of Echoes, which was made into a movie starring Kevin Bacon. And he also wrote What Dreams May Come, which was made into a movie starring Robin Williams. So that's that for that part of the shelf. Now for the back part of that shelf right there, we get John Maxim, The Bannerman Effect. This is about a assassin that ends up falling in love with a cop's daughter. So I'm not sure much more about it, but I think John Maxim was kind of in the same vein as the guy that wrote The Bourne Identity, but I'm not 100% sure. Then we get Andy McNabb and a book called Immediate Action. Andy McNabb was a SAS soldier, and he was at one point, maybe still is, one of the most highly decorated SAS soldiers in the world, I guess. I read Bravo 20, which was about some action that he had in Desert Storm, which was an interesting book. But I haven't read this one yet, but one of these days I'll get to it. And then we get David Mitchell, The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet. If the name David Mitchell sounds familiar, you might be familiar with the book Cloud Atlas. He wrote that one. I guess this was one of his earlier books. Actually, you can see it right there on the front. It says author of Cloud Atlas. So there's that. Then we get to Walter Mosley, which really good writer. This one is an Easy Rawlins novel named Bad Boy Brawley Brown. So there's that. And then I have absolutely no idea what this next book is about, but it is a chunky beast coming in at close to over 1,000 pages. It's called The Quincunx. Quincunx. I don't know what that is, but I mean, you can see that it's a pretty old, beat up book from, when was this published? Looks like copyright was 1989, so I don't know. Looks pretty beat up. Now we get to some James Patterson. I have no idea where I got this book, but it's called Now You See Her. So probably your typical James Patterson mystery type book. Then we get a little Douglas Preston, Tyrannosaur Canyon, and a guy named Michael Norman. I'm not familiar with much of his work, but it's a horror book called Haunted Homeland. And now, changing gears again, we get to a guy named Matthew Riley who writes some action-packed books. I read one of his called Ice Station, which takes place in Antarctica and has a bunch of soldiers trying to fight off some other soldiers that have been paid off by wealthy men to do some bad stuff. This one is called Temple. And this one here is called Area 7. Looks like it might have a UFO kind of a thing going on there. And then we've got another one called The Six Sacred Stones. I think this is part of a series that he wrote. I'm not 100% sure though. Then we get to a famous writer, famous for Interview with a Vampire, but this is The Witching Hour by Anne Rice, which I have. This is another chunky 1,000+ page book that I have not gotten to. And then we get to some adventure books here by a guy named James Rollins, Subterranean, Excavation. One of the reasons I like these books is that they have these cutaway covers that you open, and then you see more stuff on the inside as you go through it. It's pretty interesting. That's that one. What does Subterranean have? Subterranean has like actual pages inside that have different things on them. So yeah, pretty interesting there. And then you get Deep Fathom, which again, a cutaway thing, but that one just has one page. You get to James Rollins' sandstorm, and you can, I don't know if you can see it or if it comes through on the camera. This one has one of those covers that has that on it, so it like looks different depending on how you hold it. Then we get to Ice Hunt, which just has the one thing on the inside here. Looks like a couple women frozen in ice or something. And Amazonia, which I don't know if any of these books are out of order, but you know, you can see some of the stuff inside of them there. Then we're away from James Rollin and back to some vampire type fiction by a guy named Michael Romke. This one's called The Vampire Virus. And then The Vampire Papers. And then I, Vampire. Might have those out of order. I'm not 100% sure. Now for the front of that, the last part of this video. Here we've got John Sandford, Certain Prey. He wrote a whole series of these books. Here's another one called Night Prey. I think they follow the same investigator. So there's that series. Then we've got this one. It's kind of a historical fiction called Boudica, Dreaming the Eagle. I think it's about a female warrior chieftain or something like that. I'm not 100% sure. But it's a pretty chunky book, 700 plus pages. Then we get a World War II novel called An Exchange of Eagles, which one of these days I'll get to. Got this at a thrift shop. You get a lot of military fiction when you work on a military base and end up going to the thrift shop a bunch of times. Then we get Othello by Shakespeare, classic story. Then we get a series by Dan Simmons. Dan Simmons typically writes science fiction or horror, and this time he took a crack at hard-boiled crime fiction. So he wrote these 3 novels: Hard Case, Hard Freeze, and Hard as Nails. So there's those. And we got a couple Peter Straub books here called Dark Matter. A Dark Matter, sorry. And then Shadowland. You can see how beat up some of these are. I don't typically treat my books this badly. So these are obviously thrift store purchases, or used purchases anyway. Here's another one, The English Assassin by Daniel Silva. I read The Unlikely Spy by him. I really liked it, but this actually has a series character that he uses a lot, who I think is some sort of art guy. Then we get to The Seventh Scroll by Wilbur Smith. Now, the first book in this group of books is called The River God, and it takes place back in ancient Egypt. And I bought that book and this book at the same time because they were both on sale together. And after reading The River God, I was a little put off because the point of view character in The River God is a slave, but he's like some sort of super duper educated slave because he's like a dentist and a doctor and a nutritionist and a helper and just an engineer, and just like everything they needed, he could do it. I don't know how that's possible for a slave, but apparently it was in this guy's mind. And I know Wilbur Smith is a pretty popular author. He's written a lot of books, so he must be doing something right. But it kind of put me off. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe slaves could do some of that. I don't know. Here's one by Ross Thomas, who I think is a fairly well-known crime author. The Fools in Town Are on Our Side. Is that book? There's another Ross Thomas called The Fourth Durango, right there. And Missionary Stew by Ross Thomas. This one looks like it's older. It's shorter too than some of these others. And another Ross Thomas, Out on the Rim, right there. And I typically work in IT, and sometimes I'm kind of a sucker for romance and stuff that might make nerds look good. So I bought this book, Nerd in Shining Armor. Yeah, I haven't read it, but I bought it. Here's one by a guy named Robert C. Wilson. Looks like it's some sort of horror, maybe, called Ice Fire. Not really sure what it's about. Then we get back to some mystery or crime type stuff called, this one's by Eric Wright, called A Body Surrounded by Water. And then here's another Eric Wright called Death by Degrees. And now we get into a few anthologies before we finish that shelf out. This was an old one from like 1952. It's basically The Great SF Stories number 13, edited by Isaac Asimov. And then here's another old one as well. This one's probably from the 70s, edited by Terry Carr. The Best Science Fiction of the Year, number 5, right there. You can see how beat up this is. And then there's a whole series of these, but this is the only one I have. It's edited by Ellen Datlow and Terry Windling, and it's basically retellings of fairy tales or that kind of thing. This one's called Snow White, Blood Red, so full of short stories about that. And then the last couple books I have here from that shelf is a series from Baen Books, which is full of short stories that feature females or women in the title role, basically. And this one's called Chicks in Chainmail, which you can see there, kind of a funny take on Red Sonja, I guess. And this one's called Did You Say Chicks? And I know there's at least 2 others in them because I've got them on the next shelf down, but I'll get to those in another video. So anyway, in case you were curious, now you know it was on those 2 shelves right there. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Maybe it gave you an idea. Maybe it gave you something to look for in your local thrift shop or used bookstore. If you find something that you like, great, let me know. Put a comment down if there's something you saw that you've read before and you want to comment on it and tell me whether it's any good. Please do that as well. Bye for now.